Good morning. Very good to see you all the way from the States to Greece. I know you've been enjoying the Mediterranean the last few days. Can you remind me who you are? It's been long
The one that you were dancing with last night?
Don't tell my wife. So, can you introduce briefly?
I'd love to.
Yes.
Good morning. I'm impressed this is a good-sized crowd, given the festivities of last night. My name is Barbara Merrill, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of ANCOR. That's our acronym. We are the National Trade Association in the United States for providers of services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We have 2,600 members in every state of the country, including the territory of Puerto Rico. Our members range from very, very small providers to several providers that are so large they provide services in up to 35 states. Many of our members have national affiliations. They might be faith-based. They are overwhelmingly NGO. We refer to that as not-for-profit. We were born, I heard someone use that expression yesterday, we were born 54 years ago. Right about the time that deinstitutionalization was in full swing in the United States, and providers who had been going to conferences all about the research really got together and said, we love this research, we love it, we love it, we love it, but we need to figure out how to apply it. And so that's when ANCOR was born.
Lovely. And likewise.
And my name is Donna Martin. I am the Vice President for State Partnerships and Innovation with ANCOR. And I get the privilege of supporting our 61 state associations across the country. And I do a lot of other project-based work.
Thank you. Well, it's lovely to meet you. I think when you talked about what ANCOR is and is doing, we could recognize a lot of it. So there's this feeling in the EU that a lot of theories sometimes come from the US, and how different is it? When you've heard the last day, all the practices and the policies and the debates, what are the differences and similarities that you could notice?
Thank you, thank you. And I would like to just back up a bit and thank EASPD for inviting us to speak. I've had a number of people ask us in the last couple of days, why are you here? And I've had some people in our membership say, why are you going there? And we might mention the Mediterranean, we might mention Greek food. But this is our second EASPD conference. We were in Malta 2 years ago. And the answer is really simple, because we have far more in common than we don't. And so you asked the question of what are the similarities, what are the differences between how we are approaching getting more people into what we call competitive integrated employment, supported employment. What are the differences? What are the similarities? It's not easy. We've been working at it for a long time. Attitudes have always been really the biggest challenge. Attitudes, not just of employers, but attitudes of providers, attitudes of policymakers, attitudes of parents. So, that's always been a very big challenge. Our overall, Donna has facts and figures on her fingertips better. We also have cards in case we need prompting. But we really haven't, even though we've been working at it for a really long time, we haven't moved the needle in terms of getting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities employed in the jobs, the integrated supported employment jobs of their choice, as we would have expected to be by now. You know, I mean, what is the number?
The national average is about 19% of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have a competitive job. That may be as few as 5 hours a week. It may be as many as 40, but it is hovering around 19% and has been at that number thereabout for a long time. We do have several states, probably 10 or 11, that are really leading the way, and they have employment rates on average between 35, 36% up to 42%. But by and large, states are still very much struggling to get that number of people with IDD employed raised.
What, and so that obviously is the challenge. But what is really where we are slowly but truly surely making important progress is that changing of the attitudes. You know, we are expecting, we could be wrong. We've only have a few more months of President Biden's administration, but we are still expecting that their Department of Labor is going to put out a proposed rule that, again, we could be wrong, but that will phase out the permission to pay people with disabilities less than a minimum wage.
And can I jump in? And I would add, if the pressure does not come from the administration, there is a bill pending in Congress that seeks to eliminate that permission as well. So we are telling our members, you need to prepare for this because it is coming. This permission to pay sub-minimum wage is going to end in the not distant future, whether it's through congressional legislation or through an administrative mandate.
And if I may jump, how do you members react to that? And how is the funding for that?
I'll tell you a little story. I've headed up ANCOR for almost a decade now. Before that, you know, going back 30 years, I worked at the state level. I'm from the state of Maine. That's up in New England. We border Canada. Has a lot in common with Finland, a lot of trees, long coast, and blueberries. We learned that at dinner last night. When I was representing the intellectual and developmental disability providers in Maine, a lot of people were being served in protected employment, sheltered workshops. It was becoming very, very controversial. There was, you know, like half of the community was like, oh, that is the most awful thing in the world. And then the other half of the community, it really seemed like there was like no black and white, right? You were either for it or you were against it. The other half of the community was like, this is what people need. This is what parents want. This is dignity of work. If you close these sheltered workshops, there won't be anything for people. And so that's where it was. I then got a job. I moved out of state. I got a job working regionally and then nationally. And I don't know, about maybe 3-4 years after I left the state state officials made the unilateral decision. It wasn't passed by our legislature. It was executive action to close all of the sheltered workshops. And it was done without any transition planning. Now, if those state officials were here in the room, they might take issue with a bit of that. But really, bottom line, it was done without any transition planning, without extra funding to make sure that people would have other things to do during the day. So fast forward a couple years later, and I'm at my brand new, right? I've just been appointed CEO of ANCOR, and I'm so delighted because I have my dream job. And along comes this member of ours who doesn't provides services in Maine, he provides services in another state, but his state has been all excited about what Maine did. And he came to me and he said, Barbara, can you tell me what happened in Maine? You know, we're hearing it didn't really go so smoothly. And I said, I can't really tell you. I don't know. I've heard anecdotes. And he said, well, would you collaborate with us on retaining a university to do a research project? And I'm like, yes, right? I mean, data is important. This is important. And I said, yes. And, you know, the extent of my collaboration was I introduced them to the providers in Maine who would be able to share the experience. So they hired Georgetown University, you know, very prestigious, very well-known university based in Washington, D.C. They did the research. They came out with the report, and it was pretty damning. You know, I mean, it really, you know, essentially pointed out that when they closed that door, when they pulled the rug out from under people without, you know, sufficient transition planning, about a third of the people had nothing to do and they just went home. Now, there was also really good news. There were a lot of people who the sheltered workshop providers and employers thought would never succeed in an integrated competitive environment, and that they succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. And then there was also that other roughly third who people thought would probably do better if they were given the chance, and absolutely they did. But when that report came out, the advocates, because again, right, this was not the no gray area, right? You're either for it or you're against it. The advocates came after me. I mean, they were like, oh, how could ANCOR have its fingerprints on anything like this? And so I spent a couple of years really trying to engage in damage control, you know, and just like, look, this is research, and this research needs to be done. You know, I mean, just kind of one last thing, because I want to make it really clear to everyone where we are. You know, we, ANCOR 100% supports transitioning people out of protected employment so that people can have the jobs that they want, but it has to be accompanied with thoughtful transition planning and funding. As my colleague, Mark Davis, who's there in the second row, he is the CEO of the Pennsylvania Providers Association, said to me once, Barbara, we want to be on the right side of history.
Thank you. And you mentioned Pennsylvania. You were telling me the other day that in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, the transition story was a bit more successful and positive.
Actually, it was in Rhode Island, my home state, where in 2014, the United States Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against the state saying that it was in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act because we were, as they described, keeping people in protected employment, alleging that people did not have the opportunity for competitive integrated employment. And the state entered into a 10-year settlement agreement, a plan to change that trajectory. And so what happened in Rhode Island was a little different than the Maine experience. Our state essentially shut the front door on protected employment. So it didn't shut it down. It didn't close the day programs or the support, the sheltered work programs. But they said to providers, you can't admit anybody else. And so that started really sort of a ripple effect where the organizations that held those certificates, those permissions to pay less than minimum wage, started to not renew. They either canceled them or did not renew them. They started to look at how can we restructure our services to support people more individually in competitive employment. But where we ran into trouble and where we see a lot of states really get stuck is around the question of what does a person do with the rest of their day? So if I'm an individual with a disability and I'm working maybe 10 or 15 hours a week, what happens the rest of the time when I would have been in a protected program with friends, with associates or colleagues even, and now that's gone? So at ANCOR, we spend a fair amount of time advocating with our federal colleagues around the need for training and technical assistance to help providers bridge that gap, to really look at what kinds of supports do people need to have a fully included life in the community. And that's really hard because it's one person at a time. You know, it's not a small group, it's not an enclave, it's one person at a time. And that's challenging for sure. That's where we're seeing our members need a lot of support.
See, if I understand correctly, you have the support providers that help join the competitive employment, but then what's happening outside of employment? Are they then the same providers, because do they specialize in employment and then now they have to work on culture and environment and community living? Or are you working with several providers together? How is that organized?
I think it really varies state to state and provider to provider. Certainly, we've seen some that have formed great alliances and collaborations, but many organizations that are members of ANCOR, we call like a full service organization. They may provide residential or in-home services in addition to employment and community-based work. And I think where we see people have the most trouble is when someone lives on their own or with a family member. If someone is receiving a residential service and they're going to work a few hours a day and come home, they'll have staff there if they need that support. But for someone who lives with their family, maybe mom and dad are working their own jobs, and where the person before received a full day of support at the sheltered work or the day program, when that's no longer available, they're the ones who are really at risk of being isolated and not receiving the support to be fully included.
And in that regard, when they are separate services or even the main one, how is the funding working? Because I imagine they receive funding for employment, but then for everything else, is it recognized by the state? How do they get funded?
Do you want me?
I can start. So we have, there is an entitlement to certain services, but you have to be eligible for them. Funding for supports and services, whether they're residential or day program, employment services, are funded both by the federal and the state government. We call it the Medicaid program, and it's a matching program. So the federal government will match what the states spend, you know, up to a certain limit. No one ever reaches that limit. So the federal government, you know, it really is that big funder. And increasingly, they are now getting into dictating or directing how those dollars are being spent, but it's up to the states to determine exactly how much providers are paid. So there's a lot of disparity across the country. You know, you take states that, you know, and you can't even generalize. You know, you could take some of the poorest states in the country, like my home state of Maine is one of the very poorest states in the country. So is the state of Mississippi, way down opposite end of the East Coast. That's also one of the poorest states in the country. But the state of Maine has always had a very strong advocacy movement. And so, you know, comparatively speaking, the rates in the state of Maine are, well, comparatively speaking, they're much better than they are in the state of Mississippi. So it really varies. One of the things that states have been really working on, and advocates, and you know, we can speak a little bit about communities of practice that policymakers have put into practice to try to really understand and work together, collaborate with other states on what really works in terms of getting people into supported employment is, how do you structure a funding system? I mean, do you, if you get someone into competitive integrated employment, they get a job, do you then take the funding away from the provider? And so then, there isn't, so then perhaps the provider is not, it's a disincentive. How do you incentivize providers to get people to where they need to be? And as their supports, the need for their supports fades away, you continue to provide some level of funding, right, for perhaps more intermittent job coaching. It's tricky, and states have been working on trying to figure it out. Donna, you have more information on that.
Sure. To Barbara's point, every state's Medicaid program is different. And so every state may call a particular service by a different name. In some cases, day activities may be funded. In other states, it's not. So it really is sort of a patchwork across the country as to how the services are structured and paid for. But to that point, I think that there is, at the federal level, kind of a movement toward training and technical assistance. And so the feds are really trying to look beyond the state structures to what kinds of resources do providers need to help make this transition. And one example is ANCOR for 5 years now has been part of a grant that's paid for by the United States Department of Labor, where we are able to connect our state associations, and that's the work I do, connect our state associations with subject matter experts. And each state then gets 60 to 70 hours a year of expertise, training, and technical support. So they can really sort of shape how those hours are used and what the providers in that state may need. And they do it through a series of on-site training and guidance. They do it in broader ways with some webinars. It's really a very individualized training for ANCOR members in a given state. That makes sense.
Yes, thank you. It really sounds that you have a lot of support from the federal government, while there are differences in per state. I have a double question then. On one hand, what can you do with the states to bring the subsidies higher, and what are the tools that you've been using that you found successful to increase the funding from the states, and potentially also from the federal government? How do you get so much support from them?
I can speak to use this example from Rhode Island again. So I mentioned in 2014, the United States Department of Justice filed a suit against the state of Rhode Island. Now it's taken 10 years, but through that lawsuit, that federal lawsuit, the federal court in the state of Rhode Island applied pressure to the legislature to provide substantially more funding for the IDD service providers to help meet these employment goals. And through that, that pressure from the court, the legislature increased funding for these services from, if we look at the direct support wage, from around $15 an hour to a little over $20 an hour. So it's what we've seen, and I was working in Rhode Island at the time that that the original court suit was filed. And in conversation with the Department of Justice, we knew that this was sort of a test case. And we also knew that it was an opportunity to leverage the power of the federal government to cause action in the states. And that's what's really needed, because the states, as Barbara said, every state has sort of a different average kind of per capita revenue. And the poorer states have a harder time making these investments, obviously. But I can only speak, for what we saw in Rhode Island. Well, and it happened in a state on the West Coast as well. That pressure from the federal government did prompt action in the states.
So strategic litigation to help. What was then the role of ANCOR? And if you didn't have, what would you, in hindsight, recommend maybe other service providers? What could their role be in strategic litigation?
I'll pause on the in hindsight a little bit because, time takes time, right? I mean, so many people, everyone yesterday talked about culture. And, it is difficult to really change minds quickly. But what we have seen, and I'm hearing it here, is that, the children, young people coming into the system, they've been mainstreamed or they've just had a much more inclusive experience than the older generations, right? So there's been significant changing needs and expectations of people with disabilities themselves and their family members, and they're demanding change. Not all of them. I mean, there's absolutely a cohort, an incredibly very, very, very well-funded cohort of advocates that are saying, oh, my child has severe autism and, will never be able to, live in an integrated setting, much less hold down a job. It's, what are you doing trying to push this, push this, push this? We've been fighting bullying our entire, lives. So there is that cohort, but they are the minority. Their needs need to be listened to and responded to. But what we're just really, the overall message is the message is we've changed the presumption. The presumption used to be with people with intellectual disabilities, you can't work. But by changing the presumption, and assuming, at least starting with the idea that everyone can work and giving them that, that choice, that goal makes a huge difference. Going back, but really specifically, going back in 2005, ANCOR did something that I think was a really, it was a catalyst, one of the catalysts for change. We joined with 15 other national associations, and we put on a huge conference. 3,000 people came. It was called the Alliance for Full Participation. It was attended by providers, by policymakers, by elected officials, by members of the media, advocates, families, self-advocates. That was a real turning point. And it was repeated again 4 years later. And that's, I mean, was there one thing you kind of look back, obviously, in addition to the lawsuits, obviously, in addition to, there's been a lot of investigative reporting that is shocking, that also does change people's minds because they're shocked when they find out how some people have been exploited. But it was really that positive, bringing everyone together and sharing what works and celebrating the successes that I think has been one of the most important things that we've continued to do.
So taking note for EASPD, 3,000 people participant for the next conference. That's what will change.
You have about 18,000 more members than we do.
We are being challenged.
I envy the 18,000 more.
But so, if I hear you well, a combination of strategic litigation, investigative reporting, sorry, and support from the federal government have really bring up a change, and members and providers across the US, some go along, some believe that it's not possible for everyone. And those that want to go along, but don't have the training or the means, what happens to them? How do they just die? Are they supported? What kind of training are provided and what kind of support is provided?
That's why they need to be a member of your association. So that they have a community of practice around them, so that they have a peer group from whom they can learn and hopefully be energized and see a new path forward. That is one thing we talk about at home a lot, because as Barbara said, we have members that are very progressive, that are really leading the charge, and we have others that are very reluctant to change. And it's our role to bring them all along, and to help them, see a different future, to help them envision a different path forward. And I think associations have a very important role to play there.
And then I would add, for the people who might have spent the majority of their adult life, and obviously people with disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, living far longer than their original life expectancy. So, for people who used to spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week in a protected employment setting, when that setting is gone, right? Your question is, what happens to them? And that is why, to reinforce, we have been advocating very strongly for the federal government to step up and really take far more responsibility in providing funding for states, for providers to be able to fill in the rest of that day, not in a congregate setting, not in sort of like a daycare type setting, but with a mix, with, the opportunity of, my husband's retired, right? He doesn't go to work, but he volunteers. He goes down to the local recreation center and he volunteers. I'm trying to get him to help deliver Meals on Wheels for seniors that are at home, but yeah, and I'm also trying to get him involved in the church, but there are all of these, unsuccessfully, I might add, but there are all these types of community activities that when you're not working, most of us do, right? We volunteer, we go to the library, we go to, the recreation center to work out. That's what we increasingly call, we call community life engagement or meaningful day. And those meaningful day activities, it's not missing. There's just not enough of it. And that's what needs to be talked about, because for the longest time, it was the elephant in the room, and people didn't want to talk about the fact that not everyone can go and work 40 hours a week.
Thank you very much. So inclusive employment doesn't stop at the employment part. Thank you very much for your time. It was lovely having this conversation with you. I think we will now continue with further panels. Enjoy the rest of the day and the Mediterranean. We'll make sure to invite you next time we do a conference in the Mediterranean.